let's talk about an inner class. Alright, so before we dive in completely, and I show you an example of code with an inner class and code without an inner class, and let you know basically why you would use one versus not having one, I think it's important to let you know that an inner class is basically just a class within your script. So that could be a class within a class, or a class within a class within a class within a class, and so on. I don't know why you might have like 5 classes all within each other, but you could go that route if you really wanted to, and they would be an inner class, right? As long as we have individual classes within the script, right? So you could have a player class, and then you could have another class inside of that player class, not extending anything. And that's a key thing there. It does not extend anything. Because it does not extend anything, we cannot add it to a scene tree at any point. And not just that, since it's not extending anything as well, it's also not a globally accessible class. So, you go in, you might do, you might have an enemy class, and then you might derive from that, right? So you might create a, let's say, Hammer Bro extends enemy class, right? You can't do that. Just like if you had a, let's say, an inventory as a class, you cannot just access that inventory into an inventory.new from anywhere in your game. Just can't do that. An inner class has to stay within the script that it's in. So if you know, like, private variables, how you're not supposed to access them outside of the script or outside of that class, this is the same type of deal where you're not supposed to access that inner class outside of that script at all. Right? So what I've done, I've gone ahead to show you this, is I've just got some inputs here for jump, crouch, left, right, and special. So we're gonna have like a fighting game as an example here, and all fighting games are gonna have this. Doesn't matter if it's more of a hack and slash or if it's your 2D fighter or your tournament fighter, right? Your Mortal Kombat, Street Fighters, King of Fighters, Virtual Fighters, Tekken, and all that. They've all got the same type of deal going on, right? The player is going to have an input buffer. Now, the AI does not have an input buffer at all. The AI is just going to make decisions based off of what you're doing or whatever other conditions the developers have coded into their little brains. But you as a player going to have an input buffer, and that input buffer, what that's going to do is that's going to take whatever button you pressed, add it into the buffer, and then we can use that to check if you've done a special move or not. And after however long, that buffer will be cleared out. Alright, so that buffer will get cleared out, and it'll be, well, empty. Now, when creating this for yourself, the normal way we would come in here is we'd come in, class name, player, extends your character body 2D, and then we're going to need a buffer put in there, right? An input buffer, so we can come in, create our variable for a buffer. It's an array. We have our timer starts at 0. Interval is 0.3. This interval is going to be how long that buffer stays around before it gets removed, completely emptied out of our buffer. Right, clearing out all the old commands. And also, if you guys don't know how to make an input buffer and you've been wanting to, you can kind of take a look here, pause the video at any point and get yourself an idea of how you can create one. But we have our buffer, timer, interval. We have an add input function, right? It's just going to be a string argument, and we can add it into the buffer, and we can print out buffered inputs. Get buffer is what it is, and that's just printing out our buffer, right? Return buffer.duplicate. And once we've added a new input, we can check for a combo. and that check combo. In this case, I have a fireball sequence as an example, which is crouch, right, special. And we're basically, what we're doing here is we're going to check if there's enough inputs, then we're going to check the last X amount of inputs. In this case, 1, 2, 3, right? This has 3 inputs, so we're going to check the last 3 inputs in this case. And if those last 3 inputs matches a fireball, then we're going to do this, which in my case, I'm going to show an image, and then we clear it out. Now, in order for this to act on its own, we could just take all of this, and I think we will. We could just take all of this, move down, and we can just stick all of that inside of the process function, right? That's effectively what's going on here. So we can say if the buffer is empty, make sure the timer is set to 0, exit out. Otherwise, we're going to add to the timer if the timer exceeds our interval of 0.3 seconds, and we have items inside of our buffer, right? We already have inputs, and we're just going to empty it out. And I'll print out our empty buffer just so we can see that, and reset the timer back to 0. Now for the player itself, all we needed for the player is simply for action and input map.getAction. So we're basically just getting all the inputs available to the game. If input.isAction just pressed the action, we're basically going to take that action and call add input, right? So we're just going to add it into the buffer. So you can see if we go ahead and run this as I press buttons. All right, so as you can see here, as I press buttons, we get an input. So I press jump, we have an input in there, and then it gets cleared out after 0.3. Same left, jump, right, crouch, or special. And we can also do this in combinations, right? So we can go, there we go, left crouch, crouch right, left crouch right, right? And for our fireball, remember it was crouch, right, special. That was the input we decided. Crouch right special, boom. And we got the input recognized, and I have my image of my fireball from Liu Kang. Right? So we can check for combos, and we can see if that matches what we have inside of our buffer. Alright, now you might be asking, what does this have to do with an inner class? Because I said earlier that an inner class is a class within the script, or a class within a class, and we don't have that. All we have is a player class. Well, that is because this is how you might go about doing it initially yourself. And we can see that if we go through all of this, we can remove this entire chunk out of the process. And then this is another like 30 lines, roughly, just a little under, of variables and functions that are exclusive to this input buffer. Now, you could take these away, create a new script, and create a new class for the input buffer. Right, and then create an instance of that, and do all that, and still work it out in a similar fashion. And you'd be pulling all of this out of the script. And that's fine. However, when you're doing that, because you'd be doing, of course, class name, input buffer, and it's going to extend something. By doing that, that means it's extending some type of node, which means it can be put in the scene tree, and it's not something that should be in a scene tree, right? And because you're using class name and input buffer, it is now a globally accessible class, which is fine. However, nobody needs that input buffer except for the player. So you have a globally accessible class that is not needed anywhere aside from one specific location. And you have extra files now sitting inside of your game folder, right? Because now you have an extra script for that input buffer class. So we can get around that by actually creating what's called an inner class. So if I go to my other player script here, we can see we've taken all of this info and dumped it inside of a class called input buffer inside of this player class. I'm just going to go ahead and rename this. I'm going to call this players just to get rid of that error. There we go. So now inside of this player class, this has access to a new class called input buffer, and only the player has access to this, right? It's like a private variable, right? Which technically Godot doesn't have, but that's how you should be treating it. So it is something internal that only the player should have access to. Now, technically, we could come in here, right? If I find my ready, right? We could come in here and be like, oh, var p equals player dot input buffer dot new, right? We can go around and do that. You could. You really shouldn't, and you're not supposed to. But there's nothing stopping you from doing that with an inner class. But the point of an inner class is that you don't access it anywhere except for the place that it is being used. And since most of that code was the input buffer, we can take all that and tuck it inside of an inner class and easily access it from the player, right? So the only thing that's different here, everything up there is all the same. The only difference that we have is I have a variable here, so doing input buffer.new, and we can access this because it's an inner class that is within this script, right, of the player. And in process, I'm just getting the input buffer. I'm calling update and passing in the delta for it instead of having that chunk of code pasted into the process. It's the only thing that's happening here. That's the only thing that's different. And what this allows you to do is not only keep things private to where they're needed, but you can also just completely fold that entire inner class up, and you can use this to help keep things organized as well. So if you have an issue with an input buffer, you don't have to come through here and be like, oh, which line is this on? Which line is that on? Where is this function? Where's that? Right? You specifically know it's going to be inside of your input buffer class, and it's still going to be related to the player. And we can see if I remove this and put the other one on here and we run it, it's still going to be the exact same, right? Still going to function the same. We can still get our fireball. We still have our inputs get into the buffer and they get cleared. We still have our specials, right? It works exactly the same. So what's the point of doing these inner classes if we don't need to do them at all for any reason? Well, not only are you saving on a little bit of I don't want to say file space, but organization, because you don't need to create a new script to create a new class that'll be globally accessible that's only needed in one specific place, which is where an inner class comes in, when you only need this thing in one location. Right? It doesn't matter how many players we could create. We can create 3 players, 4 players, right? Maybe it's a 2-on-2 tag fighting game. We're going to have 4 players. They all have their own input buffers, but we still only have this one inner class. So you're saving on not needing to write a new script, not having another class registered globally across the project, and really outside of that, it's more so for keeping things clean and organized for the most part. Like I showed you with the original script, we can do all this without making an inner class. We don't really need it, right? And it's basically a copy paste of the exact same thing as with an inner class, just minus this class keyword. So hopefully you understand what an inner class is and when you would use one. As for why you would use one, just organization. That's really what it comes down to keep things organized. All right, so hopefully you learned a bit about inner classes, when to use them, which is when they're only needed in one location, as well as why you would use them, organization.